It all started so innocently, or at least, that's how I remember it now. My name is Jonathan, and for years, my life had been a quiet symphony of routine and contentment. Rachel, my wife, was the melody that held everything together. She worked as a marketing manager at a small firm in our town, a job she loved but often complained about because of its monotony. Me? I was an architect, designing buildings that would outlast me while trying to build something just as enduring with her. We lived in a cozy house on the edge of the city, surrounded by trees whose leaves turned golden every autumn. We shared coffee every morning, laughed over dinner every evening, and dreamed about traveling the world when we retired. It wasn't perfect, no marriage ever is, but it felt real, or so I thought. Then came the day she announced her new job. "Jonathan," she said one evening, her voice trembling with excitement, "I got the offer. The position in the city. I took it." Her eyes sparkled like they hadn't in months, maybe even years. At first, I was happy for her. How could I not be? This was the kind of opportunity she'd always wanted. A chance to grow, to shine, to prove herself beyond the confines of her old role. But there was something else beneath her words, a flicker of hesitation I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Nervousness? Hope? I didn't know then, but looking back, I wonder if she did. The weeks leading up to her first day were filled with shopping sprees for professional clothes, late-night conversations about logistics, and promises that nothing between us would change. "This won't affect us," she assured me, squeezing my hand tightly. "You'll see, it'll bring us closer." And yet, there was a distance creeping into her gaze, subtle but undeniable, like she was already somewhere else, mentally preparing for a life I wasn't part of anymore. On her first day, I kissed her goodbye and watched her drive away, her car disappearing around the corner. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, why wouldn't she come home to me? Why wouldn't she choose me? But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, a storm was brewing, a storm I couldn't yet name. The first few weeks after Rachel started her new job were uneventful, or so they seemed on the surface. She came home later than usual, her face flushed from the day's activities, and spoke animatedly about her colleagues, the project she was assigned to, and the challenges of adapting to a larger team. At first, I listened intently, asking questions and sharing in her excitement. It felt good to see her so energized, so alive. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She began mentioning one name more than others. "Ethan? He's brilliant," she said one evening over dinner, her fork pausing mid-air. "He has this way of simplifying even the most complicated ideas. You'd like him, Jonathan." I forced a smile, nodding politely, but her tone unsettled me. There was an admiration there that went beyond professional respect. It wasn't just how she spoke about him. It was the way her eyes softened when she mentioned his name, the slight pause before she continued talking, as if savoring the memory of their interactions. At first, I dismissed it as harmless. After all, everyone has coworkers they admire, don't they? But then the excuses started. "I'll be late tonight," she'd say. Her voice clipped as she adjusted her scarf in front of the mirror. "Ethan and I are working on a presentation for tomorrow." Or, "We're meeting with clients after hours. It's important we make a good impression." Each time, I nodded and kissed her goodbye, masking the unease growing inside me. I told myself I was being irrational. Rachel had always been dedicated to her work. Why should this be any different? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, I decided to surprise her. I finished my own work early and drove to her office building, intending to take her out for coffee. As I approached the glass doors, I scanned the lobby directory, searching for her floor. That's when I saw them, or rather him. Ethan stood near the elevators, scrolling through his phone. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and an easy confidence that radiated even from a distance. His suit fit him perfectly, tailored to accentuate his frame. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside, glancing briefly at his watch. And then I saw her. Rachel emerged from another set of doors, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She spotted him immediately and quickened her pace, a bright smile spreading across her face. They exchanged a few words before stepping onto the elevator together. The doors closed behind them, sealing them off from view. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. What had I just witnessed? Was this truly innocent, a simple coworker dynamic, or was there something more beneath the surface? For the rest of the drive home, my mind raced. I replayed the scene over and over again, dissecting every detail. Her smile, the way she hurried toward him, the casual familiarity between them, none of it sat right with me. Yet, I reminded myself that I had no proof, no reason to accuse her of anything. That night, when Rachel returned home, she greeted me warmly, as though nothing unusual had happened. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter. "It was fine," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Yours?" "Oh, busy," she said with a small laugh. "Ethan and I stayed late to finalize the presentation. I think it's going to go well tomorrow." Her words felt rehearsed, almost too casual. I nodded, forcing another smile, but my stomach churned. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home, a silent observer watching a story unfold without understanding its true meaning. As she walked past me to change into comfortable clothes, I caught a faint whiff of cologne, not hers. It lingered in the air, taunting me, confirming what I didn't want to believe. That night, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. Who was Ethan to her? A colleague? A friend? Something more? And if he was more, what would I do? The days that followed were a blur of suspicion and self-doubt. I tried to push the image of Rachel and Ethan from my mind, telling myself it was all in my head, just the overactive imagination of a husband who'd spent too much time alone while his wife pursued her career. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the gnawing feeling in my gut refused to subside. Rachel seemed different now, not just distant, but secretive. She left for work earlier than usual, stayed out later, and often came home with excuses about team meetings or client dinners. Her phone, which used to sit face down on the kitchen counter during meals, was now perpetually locked or tucked away in her purse. And when I asked casual questions about her day, she answered vaguely, brushing me off with half smiles and distracted nods. One evening, as we sat together on the couch watching television, I decided to confront her, not aggressively, but gently, hoping to ease the tension between us. "Rachel," I began, pausing the show, "is everything okay? You've seemed preoccupied lately." She glanced at me, startled, as if she hadn't expected the question. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, choosing my words carefully. "You're working long hours, and you seem distant. Is there something going on at work? Something you're not telling me?" For a moment, she looked guilty. Her eyes flickered downward, and her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Then, just as quickly, she composed herself, offering a tight smile. "It's nothing, Jonathan. Really. It's just been a stressful week. This new job is more demanding than I thought it would be." Her response sounded rehearsed, almost robotic, and it only deepened my unease. Still, I nodded, unwilling to press further. After all, what could I say without sounding accusatory? Without risking an argument neither of us needed? But the cracks in our relationship continued to widen. A few nights later, I found myself unable to sleep. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As I lay there, staring into the darkness, I noticed Rachel's phone glowing faintly on the nightstand. She had fallen asleep, or so I assumed, and the screen lit up with a notification. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the phone, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it. She had never changed the passcode. Perhaps she trusted me too much, or perhaps she didn't think I'd ever snoop. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a text message from Ethan. "Hey, can't stop thinking about today. Let's grab coffee tomorrow morning before the meeting." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. There was nothing explicitly incriminating about the message. It could have been innocent, professional even, but the tone felt intimate, too familiar. And then another notification popped up. "P.S. Thanks again for dinner. I had a great time." Dinner? They had gone to dinner? Alone? My chest tightened. and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. How many other messages like this had I missed? How many times had she lied to me, hiding pieces of her life behind a facade of normalcy? I placed the phone back on the nightstand, careful not to wake her, and slipped out of bed. The room spun around me as I paced the hallway, my mind racing with questions. Was this betrayal? Or was I jumping to conclusions based on circumstantial evidence? When Rachel woke up the next morning, I was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. She entered the room cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "Jonathan," she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you all right?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I slid her phone across the table toward her. Her expression shifted instantly, from confusion to alarm to something darker, something guarded. "What's this?" she asked, though the quiver in her voice suggested she already knew. "You tell me," I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "Who is Ethan, Rachel? Really?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy between us. Finally, she sighed, sinking into the chair opposite mine. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But I wasn't sure I believed her anymore. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Rachel's confession, or lack thereof, left me reeling. She sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly around the mug of tea she had poured but hadn't touched. Her eyes darted between mine and the phone on the table, as if searching for a way to explain herself without revealing too much. "It's not what you think," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Ethan is just a colleague, a friend. We've been working closely together, that's all." I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But the evidence was right there in front of me. The messages, the late nights, the subtle changes in her behavior. And now, the tears welling up in her eyes felt less like remorse and more like fear of being caught. "Then why didn't you tell me about dinner?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Why didn't you mention that you two were meeting outside of work?" She flinched at the question, her shoulders tensing. "Because I knew you'd react like this," she snapped, then immediately softened her tone. "Jonathan, it's nothing serious. It was just one dinner. He needed help preparing for a big presentation, and we ended up talking longer than expected. That's it." "That's it?" I echoed, incredulous. "You expect me to believe that? After everything?" "I don't know what else to say," she cried, her composure cracking. "Yes, we've spent time together outside of work. Yes, we talk a lot. But it doesn't mean anything. You're blowing this out of proportion because you're insecure about my new job, about how busy I've been." "Insecure?" I interrupted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "This isn't about insecurity, Rachel. This is about trust. About honesty. Did you ever stop to think how it would feel for me to find out this way?" She looked away, guilt etched into every line of her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched taut, heavy with unspoken accusations and regrets. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." Her apology should have brought relief, but instead, it only deepened the ache in my chest. If she truly hadn't meant to hurt me, why had she kept so much hidden? Why had she let things escalate to this point? The days that followed were tense, strained. Rachel tried to reassure me that nothing inappropriate had happened between her and Ethan, but her words felt hollow, rehearsed. Every smile she offered seemed forced, every touch fleeting and uncertain. Even when she reached for my hand or kissed my cheek, it felt like an act, a performance meant to convince me, and perhaps herself, that everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the image of them together. Their shared laughter over coffee, their private conversations during late-night meetings. Had they exchanged glances that lingered too long? Had their hands brushed accidentally on purpose? Each scenario played out in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off, each frame twisting the knife deeper into my heart. And then came the day I discovered something worse. It started innocently enough. I was tidying up the living room while Rachel was at work, picking up stray magazines and straightening throw pillows. Beneath the couch cushion, I found a crumpled receipt from a restaurant downtown. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A bill for 2 entrees, a shared dessert, and a bottle of wine. But the date on the receipt stopped me cold. It matched the night she had claimed to be working late on a team project. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, scanning the items listed. There, near the bottom, was a note scrawled in pen. "Thanks for tonight. Let's do it again soon." The world tilted beneath my feet. This wasn't just a casual dinner between coworkers. This was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something intimate. By the time Rachel came home that evening, I had already pieced together fragments of the truth. I confronted her again, holding up the receipt as proof. "This isn't just about friendship, is it?" I demanded, my voice sharp with anger and pain. "You lied to me, Rachel." Again and again. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the couch, burying her head in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "It started innocently, I swear. But then, I don't know. Things got complicated." "Complicated?" I spat, pacing the room. "Is that what you call it? Cheating on your husband?" She winced at the word, but I didn't care. The dam had broken. There was no turning back now. For hours, we argued, shouting, crying, accusing. She admitted that her relationship with Ethan had crossed lines it shouldn't have, though she insisted it had never gone as far as physical intimacy. "It was emotional," she said through tears. "I thought I could handle it, keep it separate from us. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Jonathan." Her apologies meant nothing to me now. The betrayal cut too deep, the trust shattered beyond repair. That night, as she lay in bed beside me, I stared at the ceiling, consumed by a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief. Most of all, I felt cold, a numbness spreading through my veins, freezing me from the inside out. I didn't know who I was anymore, or who she was, and I didn't know how to fix what had been broken. The days that followed Rachel's confession were a blur of suffocating silence and unspoken resentment. She tried to reach out to me, touching my arm, offering soft words of apology, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every attempt at reconciliation felt hollow, like trying to glue together shards of glass that would never fit perfectly again. I began withdrawing from her, not physically, but emotionally. I stopped asking about her day. I avoided sitting beside her on the couch. Even when she cooked dinner or brought me coffee in the mornings, I accepted it without acknowledgement, as if she were merely a ghost haunting the edges of my life. Inside, though, I was anything but calm. A storm raged within me, a tempest of anger, betrayal, and helplessness. How could she do this to us? To me? After all we had built together, after all the promises we had made, how could she throw it away for someone else? Ethan's name became a poison in my mind, festering with every passing hour. Who was he to waltz into our lives and destroy everything? What gave him the right to take what wasn't his? At first, I told myself I wouldn't act on my anger, that I would rise above it, handle things maturely. But the more I thought about their shared dinners, their private conversations, the way she lit up when she spoke about him, the harder it became to suppress the rage bubbling beneath the surface. One evening, unable to bear the weight of my thoughts any longer, I left the house. Rachel barely noticed. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, likely texting him. The thought made my fists clench as I slammed the door behind me. I drove aimlessly at first, letting the cold night air seep through the cracks in my car windows. My mind raced with images of them together, laughing over wine, exchanging knowing glances, building a connection they thought I'd never discover. Each vision fueled the fire inside me until I could think of nothing else but confronting him. It didn't take long to find his address. Social media profiles revealed more than most people realized, and Ethan's was no exception. He lived in a sleek apartment complex downtown, the kind of place where young professionals mingled in rooftop lounges and sipped overpriced cocktails. As I parked outside the building, my heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and dread. What was I doing here? Was I really prepared to face him? To demand answers? Or worse, seek revenge? But the anger won out. I stepped out of the car, my hands trembling as I approached the entrance. The lobby was modern and sterile, with marble floors and glass walls that reflected my disheveled appearance. For a moment, I hesitated, staring at my reflection. This wasn't me, the man consumed by jealousy and vengeance. Or at least, it hadn't been until now. "Can I help you?" the concierge asked, eyeing me suspiciously. "I'm here to see Ethan," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "He's expecting me." The lie rolled off my tongue easily, surprising even myself. The concierge nodded and buzzed me through without question. When I reached his floor, I found his door slightly ajar, music spilling into the hallway. Without knocking, I pushed it open and stepped inside. Ethan stood near the kitchen counter, pouring himself a drink. He looked up, startled, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, and then, finally, to something akin to guilt. "Jonathan," he said, setting the glass down. "What are you doing here?" "You know exactly why I'm here," I replied, my voice icy. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, Ethan raised his hands in surrender. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, his tone cautious. "Whatever you think is going on between me and Rachel." "Don't insult me," I interrupted, stepping closer. "You've been lying to me just as much as she has. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I'd sit back and let you ruin my marriage?" His jaw tightened, and for a brief second, I saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes. But it vanished quickly, replaced by an awkward smile. "This isn't about ruining anything," he said, his voice calm but tinged with condescension. "Rachel and we connected. That's all. You can't blame me for that." The audacity of his words struck me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred with rage as I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar. "You don't get to talk about her like that," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "She's my wife." Ethan struggled against my grip, his composure cracking under the weight of my fury. "Let go of me," he shouted, shoving me backward. We stumbled apart, both breathing heavily. For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving before things escalated further. But the anger coursing through my veins was too powerful to ignore. Before I knew what I was doing, I swung my fist, connecting with his jaw. The impact sent him stumbling into the counter, clutching his face in pain. "You don't deserve her," I spat, my chest heaving. "Neither of you do." Ethan glared at me, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice laced with venom. "This isn't going to fix anything." But I didn't care. In that moment, all I wanted was to hurt him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused me. And so, I hit him again. By the time I left his apartment, my knuckles were raw, and my body trembled with exhaustion. The confrontation hadn't brought me closure. It had only deepened the void inside me. As I drove home, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. I had crossed a line, acted on impulses I couldn't control. And yet, I felt no remorse, only emptiness. The drive home was a haze of conflicting emotions. My knuckles throbbed from the impact, and my mind replayed the confrontation with Ethan over and over again. His smug expression, the crack of my fist against his jaw, the way he stumbled backward in shock. I had wanted to hurt him, to make him pay for what he had done. But now, sitting alone in the car, the weight of my actions began to settle heavily on my shoulders. What had I become? When I walked through the front door, Rachel was waiting for me. She sat on the couch, her face pale and drawn, as if she already knew something terrible had happened. Her eyes widened when she saw me. The blood on my shirt, the bruised knuckles, the coldness in my gaze. "Jonathan," she whispered, standing up cautiously. "What did you do?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I dropped my keys onto the counter and leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The anger that had consumed me just moments ago was beginning to ebb, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt and shame. "I went to see him," I said finally, my voice flat. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh God, Jonathan, please tell me you didn't." "He deserved it," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "After everything he's done, to us, to me, He deserved every bit of it. Rachel sank back onto the couch, shaking her head in disbelief. "This isn't who you are," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "You're not this person." But wasn't I? Hadn't I proven exactly that tonight? The man who had once prided himself on patience, understanding, and control had been reduced to violence, all because of betrayal. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations and regrets. Finally, Rachel broke it. "You need to leave," she said softly, her voice trembling. I stared at her, stunned. "What?" "You heard me," she replied, her tone firmer now. "I can't have you here, not after this. Not when you've lost control like this. What if you come after him again? Or worse?" Her words stung, but they also hit too close to the truth. I had acted recklessly, letting my anger dictate my actions. And while part of me wanted to argue, to insist that I could change, another part of me knew she was right. Without another word, I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began packing essentials. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items. Each movement felt mechanical, as if I were watching someone else go through the motions. When I finished, I stood in the doorway, looking at Rachel one last time. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but didn't respond. And with that, I left. The days that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. I stayed at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, avoiding calls from friends and family who likely sensed something was wrong. How could I explain what had happened without sounding unhinged? Without admitting that I had let jealousy and rage consume me entirely? Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Ethan's face, or worse, Rachel's tear-streaked expression as she told me to leave. The guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, compounded by the realization that I might never get her back. At first, I tried to justify my actions. He had crossed a line. He had taken something precious from me. But deep down, I knew that violence wasn't the answer. It hadn't solved anything. It had only made things worse. One afternoon, while aimlessly wandering the streets, I found myself outside the office building where Rachel worked. I told myself I wasn't there to spy on her or confront her. I just needed to see her, even from afar. Through the glass windows of the lobby, I spotted her talking animatedly with a group of coworkers. She looked different somehow, lighter, freer. There was no sign of the tension or sadness that had plagued her during those final weeks at home. Then, Ethan appeared beside her. They exchanged a brief smile before heading toward the elevators together. My chest tightened as I watched them disappear behind the closing doors. For a moment, I considered storming inside, demanding answers, but I stopped myself. What good would it do? Would it bring Rachel back? Would it undo the damage I had caused? Instead, I turned away, walking until my legs ached and my thoughts grew numb. Weeks passed, and the isolation began to take its toll. I realized I couldn't keep running from my mistakes. If I wanted any chance of rebuilding my life, of earning Rachel's forgiveness, I needed to start by confronting my own flaws. I reached out to an old friend, Marcus, who had always been a voice of reason. Over coffee, I confessed everything: the affair, the fight with Ethan, the anger that had spiraled out of control. To my surprise, Marcus didn't judge me. Instead, he listened patiently, offering advice when I asked for it. "You can't change the past," he said gently, "but you can decide how you move forward. Do you want to be the guy who lets anger define him? Or do you want to be better, for yourself, and maybe someday, for Rachel?" His words stuck with me. That night, I wrote Rachel a letter, a heartfelt apology for everything I had done wrong. I didn't beg for forgiveness or ask her to take me back. I simply acknowledged my mistakes and promised to work on becoming a better version of myself. I mailed the letter without expecting a response. To my astonishment, she called me a few days later. "I got your letter," she said, her voice hesitant but kind. It meant a lot to me. We talked for hours that night, not about the affair or the fight, but about our shared history, the love we had once built together. By the end of the call, we agreed to meet in person, not to reconcile, but to talk honestly about whether there was still hope for us. Our meeting took place at a quiet park near the edge of town. We sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, the autumn leaves swirling around us in bursts of gold and crimson. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Rachel admitted after a long silence. "Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. But I do believe you're trying to change, and that matters." Her honesty hurt, but it also gave me clarity. Rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight. If it happened at all, it would require patience, effort, and countless conversations like this one. Over the following months, we met regularly, slowly piecing together fragments of our relationship. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, arguments, and setbacks. But there were also glimpses of hope, shared laughter, lingering touches, reminders of why we had fallen in love in the first place. As for Ethan, he transferred to another department shortly after our confrontation. Whether it was coincidence or deliberate avoidance, I'll never know. Either way, his presence faded from our lives, leaving behind only scars that would take time to heal. A year later, I stood in the same park where Rachel and I had begun rebuilding our relationship. This time, however, she was by my side, holding my hand as we watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. We weren't the same people we had been before the betrayal. Too much had changed, too many wounds had been opened and stitched back together. But in some ways, that was okay. Our love had grown stronger, not despite the pain, but because of it. "I'm proud of you," Rachel said softly, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Me too," I replied, smiling faintly. "Of both of us. Life is fragile, unpredictable. Betrayal can shatter it, but redemption can rebuild it, if you're willing to put in the work." And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, I knew we were ready to face it, together.